Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, we continue with the Indo-Pacific and how it is viewed Southeast Asia and the Japan-Southeast Asian relations.
All right, so good morning, Maya, and good morning to friends on this Clubhouse room. I see actually quite a few Southeast Asians online, which is great. So please jump into the discussion and share your views of the Indo-Pacific from Southeast Asia, because it's a great opportunity to share your wisdom with the other callers online. So I do encourage Han and Raymond and Lynn and Lan and others that are from the region to do share their views. So today's theme is looking at the Indo-Pacific from the view of Southeast Asia, and how is Southeast Asian countries understanding the so-called Indo-Pacific Vision or strategy that's emerged out of many countries. What is the implications for Southeast Asia? And I keep using Southeast Asia rather than ASEAN, but I'll come back to ASEAN. And then how are they interpreting these kinds of geopolitical concepts? So there's a lot on the plate, but we're going to try and do this sequentially, and I don't want to speak more than about 15 minutes. I'd rather have that dialogue with the people on the call. But I think most of us understand that this Indo-Pacific concept really emerged from Japan beginning in 2007 with former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo visiting India, giving a speech about the confluence of the two oceans. And, the initial framing was to connect the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and talk about how this was a synergistic relationship where trade and culture would travel back and forth and create a more prosperous region based on the long historical ties that existed. Now, when Prime Minister Abe came back into power, the concept was revised, and we saw the Japanese government promote a so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy or vision. They initially used the word strategy, and that was changed to a vision because they felt that the strategy part was over-securitized in the sense that the Japanese kanji that was used for strategy, sennaku, had one of the characters had the kanji for war, and this created interpretations within the region that this was an aggressive vision of the region. And what we've seen emerge out of Japan is Indo-Pacific Vision that focuses on rules-based behavior within the region, continuing to focus on infrastructure connectivity, focusing on building shared institutions, and a large component that focuses on the maritime domain of the Indo-Pacific region. So with that in mind, I think that we also saw Indo-Pacific strategy emerge under the former administration in the United States, and it was highly securitized, and it had a strong focus on China, and in particular the Communist Party of China, in formulating its approach to the region. And the securitized approach created many challenges, I think, for Southeast Asian countries, but also for Japan and others that were interested in not so much a containment strategy vis-a-vis China, but a strategy or a framing to engage within the region so that they could focus on development, institutions, good governance, as well as the challenges associated with China's reemergence as the biggest economy within the region. So we've had a challenge, I think, in the Japanese context of branding and distinguishing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that the Japanese are advocating from the Indo-Pacific strategy that the former administration of the United States was promoting. Now, the United States under President Biden will likely shift that view. They're currently under review in terms of their Indo-Pacific strategy and what that will mean for the region. But I think what's most important for us to be thinking in terms of the context of Southeast Asia is how uncomfortable Southeast Asian countries felt with an overly securitarized Indo-Pacific strategy coming from the United States, and the conflation of the Japanese FOAP vision with the U.S. Strategy. So why did they feel conflicted? Simply, they were concerned about being forced to choose between their long-standing and deep and comprehensive economic partner, that's China, and the security relationship and the diplomatic footprint that the United States provides to the region. Now, I would say that the Southeast Asia countries have enjoyed investment, foreign direct investment from the United States for decades. They've enjoyed the diplomatic footprint of the United States within the region, but they loathe to choose between their security partner and their economic partner. And this has created a challenge for Southeast Asian countries in terms of thinking about how they should be conceptualizing the Indo-Pacific vision or strategy that's being promoted by Japan in the case of the vision, or the strategy being promoted by the United States. Now, this leads us to a different discussion. How does ASEAN feel about this? And I think if we look at the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook document that was released, I think it was in 2018, that maybe Han or someone else on the call can correct that date. But the Indo-Pacific Outlook that the ASEAN states released really put ASEAN centrality back into the Indo-Pacific equation. And what that means is that the region would continue to evolve using ASEAN-centered principles such as consensus-based decision-making. So simply, ASEAN functions based on this idea that there must be consensus with all 10 countries in the ASEAN organization for a decision to be made on a particular issue. And ASEAN felt that this was a critical way for the Indo-Pacific to continue to develop, that the ASEAN principle would continue to be the principle by which the Indo-Pacific region continues to deepen its integration. Second, and importantly for ASEAN, was this idea of ASEAN being the driver of integration rather than outside players or geopolitics. And what that means, again, is this focus on ASEAN principles as being the way that decisions are made between the various countries and regions in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, this formulation of ASEAN being the driver of regional integration and outside countries such as Japan, South Korea, and China as being the engine of regional integration really started back in 1997. It's continued up until maybe 2015, 2016, when the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision or Indo-Pacific Strategy emerged from various countries. And there's really an open question, is ASEAN really the driver of regional integration? And I'll come back to that discussion because they're not the biggest economy within the region. They're not the most institutionalized association within the region. And there's many challenges associated with governing, associated with dealing with the security challenges within the region, and associated with development. This is an open question if ASEAN really is the driver of regional integration, and if ASEAN centrality is the best way forward in terms of thinking about the Indo-Pacific region integrating in terms of economy, diplomacy, institutions, shared norms, and shared behavior. But because of ASEAN's demands for ASEAN centrality as articulated in the so-called ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, and because of calls or concerns from prominent politicians, for example, from the Singapore Prime Minister Lee, about ASEAN countries not wanting to choose between the United States and China, what we've seen is that Japan in particular, but I would say this is true also of the United States, have tried to re-emphasize the importance of ASEAN in their strategies and in their visions, and putting forward this concept of ASEAN centrality when talking about regional integration within the Indo-Pacific. We've seen this focus of ASEAN centrality in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision, if you look at the diplomatic blue book that's released by Japan, but also in the Indo-Pacific Strategy and some of the various documents that have come out of the United States in terms of prioritizing the development and infrastructure and connectivity and institution building in Southeast Asian countries. Now, there's a very, very good example of this, and I think that the pandemic has provided countries even more impetus for investing in Southeast Asia. But what we saw when Vice President Kamala Harris visited Vietnam back in July is that the United States opened up a Center for Disease Control in Hanoi as part of their broader engagement strategy to build strong diplomatic, economic, and health ties with Southeast Asia. Japan as well has been very active. The former Prime Minister Suga, his trips abroad were to Indonesia and Vietnam. The former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, visited the region not once, not twice, but I think he visited all 10 countries 3 times while he was Prime Minister. And of course, we've seen Kamala Harris and high-level U.S. officials also visit the region during the pandemic. And these are important signals to try to send the message to ASEAN countries that the Indo-Pacific vision that the Japanese are advocating and the strategy that the Americans are advocating, and frankly, the guidelines and other visions that have come out of Europe really are going to try and maintain ASEAN's centrality within the position and try to ensure that it is the driver of regional integration in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, I think that they're trying to find creative ways to move the Indo-Pacific concept in a way that really focuses on what it's for, not so much what it's against. And I think this is going to be a critical thing for us to be watching moving forward. Lastly, in thinking about Southeast Asia in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, I think it's important to look at the most recent AUKUS agreement, as well as the Quad and how the Quad has evolved over the past 2 or 3 years. I'll start with the AUKUS agreement. Some scholars and some critics will say that the AUKUS agreement is counter to ASEAN's interests and Southeast Asian countries' interests. But I think that is something that we need to look into, not at the ASEAN level, but each Southeast Asian country. And I think if you go to Vietnam and you go to the Philippines and perhaps a couple other countries in Southeast Asia, while their public face of AUKUS is of course critical, I think their private interpretations of AUKUS are somewhat different and more nuanced. AUKUS represents the anchoring of the United States, the UK, and Australia into the region over the long term through these nuclear submarines, which will provide significant deterrence capabilities to the region, but also demonstrates that these 3 countries are going to contribute to the region through cooperation and coordination, collaboration with each other in terms of sensitive technologies such as AI and quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, cybersecurity, and other areas. And this is not necessarily a bad thing for many of the countries that have challenges with their larger northern neighbor. Similarly, the Quad has continued to evolve. I think if we looked at it 4 or 5 years ago, it was primarily a maritime security-focused dialogue framework. And today we've seen a huge shift in the Quad to try and deal with, I think, the needs and the concerns of ASEAN countries. So the Quad has really shifted towards public good provision. We saw this at the virtual Quad Summit back in March 2020 or 2021, in which Mr. Biden, Mr. Suga, Mr. Modi, and Mr. Morrison agreed to provide vaccine production capabilities and distribution capabilities to India. They talked about infrastructure and connectivity. They talked about many issues that are important for the region. And this was good. And this was reinforced at the Live Summit just this past September, in which the four Quad countries again doubled down on their commitment to much more development-focused initiatives in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia, including supply chains and supply chain resilience, both in terms of the low-value supply chains, that clothes and other goods that we use every day, but also cooperation in particular technology sectors, which will be critical to contributing and building the economy moving forward. So what we've seen is that Japan and the United States and others have become more sensitive to the needs of Southeast Asia, their concerns about choosing between China and the United States, and their whether it's pride or their priority of ensuring that ASEAN centrality remains the key principle of Indo-Pacific integration within the region. And with that, they look at the Quad's evolution towards more public good provision as a net positive for Southeast Asia. They look at the changing rhetoric from Japan and others that's focusing on what they'll bring to the region rather than what they're against as positive to ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries. But there's also their views are also tempered by realism, not as a collective group, but in terms of some of the individual Southeast Asian countries when looking at the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, that new partnerships such as AUKUS really will be critical to providing a security, a long-term security commitment to the region, which is critical, but not something that they would like to advocate or support openly. So those are a few ideas just to kind of start the discussion today. I'm really interested in our Southeast Asian friends' views about the Indo-Pacific, but of course everybody on the call as well.
Hello, Chao Ting. How are you today?
Hello. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you, Maya and Stephen. So today the topic is about the position of Southeast countries toward the Indo-Pacific strategy, as I understand it. So I have discussed with some scholars from Southeastern countries, and the majority of their opinion is that the majority opinion is that the Southeast Asia countries will select one strategy of hedging. That means they will not take side between China and the United States. Actually, the situation is that most Southeastern countries are reliant on China in economic terms, and they depend on the U.S. From a security perspective. So that's their position. But on the other hand, I have also read some articles written by John Mearsheimer, the international relations expert of offensive realism from the U.S. His argument is very clear. He argues that the Southeast Asia countries will take side of the United States, definitely. And they will join the United States to contain China because China is too close to Southeast Asia countries. Therefore, they have no choice but to join the U.S. So this is the argument of John Mearsheimer. On the other hand, I have read one book written by David Shenbao. He is another international relations expert of the U.S. And he has written one book with the name Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia. This book is very interesting. He has analyzed the situation in almost all the Southeast Asia countries. For David Shenbao, that the picture is very complicated. Some Southeast Asia countries will take side of the U.S. For example, Philippines and Thailand. They are the they are treaty allies of the U.S., so they will join the U.S. to contain China. But some other Southeast countries, especially in the continental part, Southeast Asia, such as Laos, Cambodia, they will join China because they have very close relations with China in economic, political, and military terms. So the picture is very complicated. I would like to ask you for your opinions regarding the position of Southeast China in the strategic competition between China and the U.S., especially their attitude toward the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chao Ting. So I think that you've kind of brought up the authors that broadly framed the Indo-Pacific debate. And as you mentioned, John Mishimura talks about this idea of containing China, and David Schaumburg talks about the more nuanced view. I wish David actually quoted my chapter that I wrote maybe 6 years ago about similar lines. Is that I do think that there's the idea that Southeast Asia will come together and help the United States contain China is not a very good reading of the diversity and heterogeneity within Southeast Asia. Their economic relationship and their cultural ties with Southeast Asia, and the reality that how difficult it would be for Southeast Asian countries to really marshal their forces collectively. I think that is one challenge, but to work against China as China is their biggest economic partner. And I just don't see Southeast Asian countries having the desire to do that. I don't think they have the capability to do that, and I don't think that they are institutionalized enough to be able to work together in a concerted way to work together or with an extra-regional partner like the United States to contain China. So in my view, I don't think that's possible. And my last point on that is ASEAN really lacks leadership. And there's not one country or one political figure within the region that really speaks for the region. And I think that really sends the strongest of signals that ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries working collectively to contain China alongside the United States is just really an unrealistic, it's an unrealistic vision of the region. And I think it's, again, a poor reading of the heterogeneity of the region and their strong economic and cultural ties with China. But that being said, I do think there are forward leaners in terms of thinking about China, but there are limits to what they would like to do. And let me just give you an example of Vietnam. So Vietnam, if you travel to Vietnam, there's not a lot of love between China and Vietnam. And at the same time, they have a shared political system, although they're somewhat different. They're both proponents of socialism. Of course, China has socialism with Chinese characteristics, and Vietnam is evolving their socialism with Vietnamese characteristics. And there's a lot of inter-party affiliations between China and Vietnam today. And those party ties are really critical in terms of how Vietnam sets limits in terms of their bilateral relations with China. And they have many problems with regards to the South China Sea and how the Vietnamese feel China looks down on Vietnam and has a hierarchical relationship with Vietnam. But at the same time, the solidarity between the parties remains an important part of how they engage, and that will continue to be important moving forward. So Vietnam is taking a very nuanced position towards China. I wouldn't call it containment. I would call it a kind of engagement process where it brings in and creates more strategic partnerships with other outside actors to deal with the challenges that it has with China on a very case-by-case basis. The Philippines as well, it's unrealistic, despite the poor or unfavorable ratings of China in the Philippines. There's real limits of what the Philippines can do because of its government, because of its levels of development, and the reality is that the economic relationship is important for the Philippines and its development moving forward. So that's my response to your insights. I think that moving forward, the region will continue to struggle to have a unified approach to managing its relationship with China, and likely similar difficulties in managing its relationships with the United States. But I think they'll have more success in managing their relationships with Japan, simply because Japan has a very extensive and engaged footprint in all the Southeast Asian countries through its extensive ODA and FDI infusions into the region. Thanks, Chating.
So you mentioned that Quad and AUKUS, they have been moving from purely maritime agreements to frameworks which provide more good for the people. And I wonder, what are the drivers to that? Is it the competition between, let's say, China and the United States and Japan, or are there any other drivers?
So I think the Quad and AUKUS are somewhat separate. They are separate.
Yeah.
So the Quad really, I think, was taken with great hesitancy in Southeast Asia initially because it focused on maritime security. I think China painted it as the beginnings of an Asian NATO that would be used to contain China.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is, again, a misreading of the alignment of India and Japan and Australia and the United States on security concerns within the region and the limits of each country in terms of what they're willing to do within that strategic dialogue. I think the four players really listened to Southeast Asian countries' hesitancy about the Quad as a purely securitized organization, and they have shifted their view that the Quad should be about public good provision. So I think that has been shaped and driven and will continue to evolve because of the Quad countries' priorities, but also their understanding that without Southeast Asia or ASEAN buy-in into the Quad and the Indo-Pacific vision in general, that it's likely not going to be able to institutionalize the regional integration process and develop shared values and shared norms. So I think that it's just realism about what's the best way to create stronger institutionalized relations within the region. At the same time, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic really shone light on the importance of providing public goods, whether that's health, public goods, infrastructure and connectivity, focusing on inclusive development, and that the Quad is really an excellent vehicle to do that by engaging with the region and trying to deal with some of the challenges within the region. AUKUS, on the other hand, I think is a little bit different for us to be thinking about. I think that the United States has come to the realization that the Quad partners, as currently configured, really have limits to what they would like to do in terms of deterring China. And as a result, they took the most forward-leaning countries, that's Australia, the UK, and of course the United States, to set up very, very strong deterrence capabilities through nuclear cooperation. But at the same time, they've created a framework in which they can cooperate on sensitive technologies and the technologies that really are going to shape the region's evolution moving forward. So AI and quantum computing will change how economies work, they'll change how we communicate, they'll change how we govern, how we solve problems like COVID. And I think the view in the three capitals is that they need to be at the forefront of this so that they are shaping the region and dominating the key technologies that are going to really shape the region and the world in the next century to come. Now, this second level of AUKUS is where I think countries like Japan, Canada, New Zealand, maybe Germany, and others will be able to plug in and cooperate on these sensitive areas of technology, but they will be behind a firewall. The idea is to prevent intellectual property theft and prevent espionage that will potentially steal these technologies and use them to shape the region. So it's a firewall in terms of technological cooperation, and I think that will continue. So if we look at this Quad, we look at AUKUS together, there's a deterrence layer, and that's with the most forward-leaning Indo-Pacific stakeholders, and that deterrence is primarily targeted at China, but arguably there's a portion that's targeting North Korea as well. The technology layer, again, is focusing on the key technologies that are going to shape the region and the global economy moving forward. And this is somewhat more permeable to the traditional partners of the United States. And then the Quad has really evolved towards the provision of public goods within the region with a much, much, much smaller maritime security footprint.
Excuse me, Maya and Stephen, if you don't mind, I have one more question.
Sure, go ahead, Xiaoting.
Okay, so it's clear that there is one Sino-American strategic competition in Southeast Asia. Yeah, maybe containment is very controversial, but the strategic competition is widely accepted. And Secretary of State Blinken has clearly claimed that China is the most serious geopolitical test of the U.S. in the 21st century. So from my point of view, the strategic competition is taking place in Southeast Asia countries. But how will China and the U.S. pursue the strategic geopolitical competition? This is very interesting. For China, it still lacks the military presence, and its military forces are still not as powerful as the U.S. military forces. China has mainly used geoeconomic means to achieve its geopolitical and geostrategic ends. For example, China has invested a lot in infrastructure development in southeastern countries, and the maritime Silk Road in 21st century is a very important project for China, for Chinese power projection and influence operation, right? And then from the U.S. side, they have very strong security connections with the southeastern countries, and they have security treaties with many countries in this region. And they also have military presence. They have trained many southeastern countries for their security forces, and they have very strong security cooperation. So from my point of view, the U.S. has mainly used the geopolitical and military means to achieve its strategical ends in this region. That means China and the U.S. are competing against each other in this region, but they are using different instruments and means. China mainly use geoeconomic means, and the U.S. mainly use geopolitical means. So I think for the Southeast Asian countries, they have a dilemma for the choice between economic interest and security protection. Let's use protection. This word probably not suitable. I mean, it's a dilemma for them. Which is more important, economic interest with China or security guarantee from the U.S.? So I would like to hear from you. What's your opinion on this dilemma of Southeast Asia countries?
So thank you very much, Xiaoting. So, the Southeast Asian countries have said it for themselves. They don't want to choose between the United States and China. So I don't think they prioritize one or the other. They're both important, and they want to maintain both relationships. But I would like to just comment on the fact that how you contrasted the geoeconomic strategy to achieve China's goals within the region with the geopolitical strategy or approach that the U.S. has. I think we should be very clear that actors such as Japan or Australia, they have both approaches. Japan is part of the TPP-11. They're part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They've built the Japan-EU Economic Partnership. They've built the Japan-EU Infrastructure Connectivity Initiative. All of these are geoeconomic tools to shape the region and to build the region and further deepen trade integration. Australia is part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership as well as TPP-11. Australia understands the best way to shape the region is not necessarily through military might, but through strong trading relations, investments, also through education, scientific exchanges. So I think it's a bit of an oversimplification to only think about Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific through the lens of the strategic competition between China and the United States, because they're not the only players in the region. And again, even South Korea with its southbound policy is investing deeply in Southeast Asia because it's an important area for the manufacturing of Korean goods. And South Korea would like to continue to see the region to evolve to be a little bit more strategically autonomous towards not only China, but also other countries like the United States. So I think we need to be really nuanced how we're looking at Southeast Asia. And it's not just the US and China that are shaping its views about the Indo-Pacific, but Japan, Australia, and others that are really thinking about what's the best way for this region to be to continue down the regional integration path. And that is through economic engagement, through helping Southeast Asia countries become more strategically autonomous. And in order to do that, that means economic engagement. That means promoting intra-ASEAN economic integration. That means promoting infrastructure connectivity. That means building institutions. And I think that's really, really critical for us to be thinking about. The U.S. seems to be hesitant to these geoeconomic side, at least the former administration. But I think this current administration understands that any strategic competition with China in Southeast Asia is going to have to follow, a more Japanese or Australian approach to the region, and it's going to require much more economic engagement, trade engagement, diplomatic engagement, and less of that hard security approach to the region. Han, I see you in the room. You have something to share?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Maya and Stephen, for inviting me to the discussion. For Mr. Charting questions and the book and the two scholars he mentioned, I just have a comment that I think Shambao, for his book, China's and U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia, this is his new book. I think he had in what I believe a relatively balanced assessment of American and China's engagement in Southeast Asia, and I would like to recommend that book if you are interested in. I believe that is no one in Southeast Asia, no Southeast Asian leader want to choose between China and the United States, and they are likely to prolong the balancing as long as they can, and I think that both China and the United States also China and the United States also understand that kind of situation. They are going to press Southeast Asian countries to side with them, but probably would not press too hard because they think that because the Southeast Asian country might feel like the pressure will be too much for them to handle, and they will start looking for outside partners.
So, Stephen, we all talk about China and how Japan and the United States, Australia, India, and the other countries in the region, they create economic engagements with China and, well, new regulatory institutions for, basically developing the region. But we don't seem to talk a lot about North Korea. And so I just wonder, how does North Korea fit in the picture?
So North Korea, I think the primary challenge from North Korea is, of course, weapons proliferation and eroding the United States security footprint within the region. But I think it's more of a short-term challenge rather than a challenge that is fundamentally reshaping the structure of the region, how the region's economy is going to work. China's expansive Belt Road Initiative, which is reshaping regional integration. The support of a digital economy. China represents a really comprehensive challenge to, I think, the post-World War II system. And some of that is an improvement of the post-World War II system. Some of it will be deterioration of the post-World War II system in terms of probably promoting less transparency in international institutions, not as much rule of law in international institutions, so that its political system is safe. So I think that North Korea represents a security challenge, but it's a very targeted security challenge associated with regime insecurity in North Korea, where China represents a challenge and an opportunity for the whole region in terms of fundamentally reshaping it in a different way through the development of technologies, through a different view about security, through a different view about how international institutions will work. So I think that they're very different kinds of challenges, but China's reemergence is the largest economy within this region, and it will be the biggest economy in the world in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. What does this mean for development, for rulemaking, for leading the integration process? And these are the core questions that I think that we're interested in when we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, and again, when we're thinking about where does China fit within that process.
And Ren, sorry for keeping you waiting.
Oh, no problem at all. Hey, good evening. Hello, as always. Thank you, Stefan, for always your great insights. And I have maybe a couple of questions. I'll ask you one at a time.
Sure.
I think you mentioned, if I heard you right, you said the AUKUS, US and Australia and UK, and you said something about second tier or a second line. You included a country like Japan, Canada, and New Zealand. And I think I heard you mention Germany. Did I heard you right?
Yes.
Germany was a surprise to me. If it were France, I wouldn't be surprised because, France and Australia were trying to work together on a submarine, right? What is Germany's angle into this, and why is France not Germany? Why is Germany not France? Is the first question.
So here I'm specifically thinking about the technology side of cooperation, and I'm not thinking about nuclear submarines at all. I don't think Japan or Germany or Canada or New Zealand would accept a nuclear submarine. It's not in their it's not. I think some could afford it, but I think others couldn't. I don't think that it's the view of how they would like to contribute to the region, and this is why I said I think Germany and other countries, including France, may want to plug into some kind of cooperation on AI and quantum computing, because I think that they understand that these are critical tools to shaping the next 100 years economy, and that they want to be part of the technological development, but also the rules-making process associated with regulating these technologies. And I think that is such a key point. And we're using Clubhouse today, and we use the internet, of course, every day. All of these technologies were developed in the U.S. and they follow U.S. standards and U.S. protocols. And I think this is really a good example of why you want to be on the forefront of technological development, because you will produce the standards and the regulations that could determine how not just your country, but other countries as well use these critical technologies. And I think this is, again, goes to my point about Germany potentially contributing to this, Japan potentially contributing to this, because they're relatively like-minded in terms of thinking about standards, regulations, the importance of transparency, the importance of privacy, and maintaining ethical uses of technology to improve the lives of ordinary citizens, but at the same time maintain that strong separation between privacy and how governments can use data.
Thank you. That makes sense. And my second question is Five Eyes. Five Eyes included Australia, US, and UK, but it included Canada and New Zealand already. Why is AUKUS not starting with New Zealand and Canada to begin with, if Five Eyes have been so strong? Maybe you can help us understand the difference between Five Eyes and AUKUS and why AUKUS excluded. I didn't exclude, but didn't start with Canada and New Zealand in the first place.
Okay, so on the New Zealand side, New Zealand has a zero tolerance policy towards nuclear technologies, and this includes nuclear submarines. So I think that they couldn't be part of the AUKUS agreement from that point. In the case of Canada, Canada doesn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy or a vision, and it has not been a proactive leader in the region. Hopefully that will change. Canada is going to come up with their own Indo-Pacific vision in the coming months, but they are out there. And I think, I was in Ottawa last week, and I heard this many times from the Canadian counterparts, is we're not part of AUKUS because we haven't been part of, really outward in terms of contributing to the Indo-Pacific debate.
I see.
I'd just add one thing. I think that, critical players see the current government in Ottawa as really not in tune with the broader issues within the region and the broader challenges within the region. And as a result, I think that they are not seen as a serious player, and that meant being excluded from the AUKUS agreement.
Thank you. That makes sense. And last question, this is a short one. Which southeastern country you think will be the first or the most influential contributor to AUKUS, if there is one?
So I don't think there will be a prominent Southeast Asian country that will contribute to AUKUS, especially explicitly. I think AUKUS is divisive within Southeast Asia, and I don't think there's the area for Southeast Asia to really add on much value to AUKUS. From the nuclear submarine standpoint, I think that it's unrealistic to purchase such an expensive item. Second, I don't think the United States would be willing to share that technology with any of the countries in the region. Third, it goes back to Chao Ting's point, is that Southeast Asian countries, they depend on China for their economic development. It's their biggest trading partner, and it's very difficult for them to take any position that will make that trading relationship difficult with China. They have lived beside China for centuries. They understand the potential for benefit, but also the potential for punitive behavior by China if they take a harder line. And that goes back to Han's point, is that they want to extend the balancing aspect of the bilateral relations as long as possible to prevent being squished between the United States and China.
I see. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Ren.
Excuse me. So I have a comment about the question of AUKUS.
Okay.
I think Southeast Asia countries will be very reluctant to join AUKUS, and the U.S. Will not share their nuclear submarine technology with them either. Okay, U.S. has only shared this technology with UK, so Australia is the second. But I do think there will be some countries who are interested in AUKUS airlines. For example, Taiwan. I think it's very likely that Taiwan will stay very close with AUKUS because Taiwan is facing realistic military threat from mainland China. And recently, the situation in Taiwan Strait is very explosive. Okay, and China has sent 150 military fighter jets into Taiwan's identification zone. So I think Taiwan will be eager to join AUKUS if it's possible. Okay.
So thank you, Xiaoting. And well, Lin, are you there?
Yes, I'm
Yes.
here. Good evening from Japan. Yes, I'm Ling. I'm from Vietnam, and I have a questions for Professor Steven. Actually, I'm still wondering if China is the only reason why some Southeast Asian countries, particularly in the case of Vietnam, seems to be very hesitant. It seems to me that it's very hesitant to voice its direct support for Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific. Because I think the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific and Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision somehow shares the same values, such as maintaining peace, freedom, and prosperity in the region. But why Japan openly voiced its support for ASEAN outlook, proven is by the recent speech by Japanese new Prime Minister Kishida at the 16th online East Asia Summit, when he praised and heralds ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific region. But it seems to me that Southeast Asian countries, specifically in case of Vietnam, are still quite very careful in their direct support for Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'm wondering that besides the China reason, are there any particular reason for Southeast Asian countries' hesitancy? And my second question is, based on the recent surveys for many consecutive years, that Japan is considered the most trusted partner in Southeast Asian region. Do you think that Japan can take the leadership role in the free and open Indo-Pacific in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Those are really good questions. And again, I'm really happy that there's some Southeast Asian people online raising these questions because, again, you can teach me a lot. So I think that Vietnam's hesitancy vis-a-vis the Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision is really part of Vietnam's broader approach. You know, it recently adopted the fourth no, right? No to alliances, no to and no to, I can't remember the fourth no, and maybe Han, you could jump in here and help me, but the four no's included not building alliances, but also not supporting, I guess, a containment or an aggressive approach to a third party. So Vietnam has a long-standing tradition towards being hesitant to supporting alliances or any kind of initiative that could be perceived as aggressive or targeted one particular country. And I think this explains Vietnam's position. But really, if we go through Southeast Asia and go to Myanmar, Myanmar is not going to jump on the page of the the free and open Indo-Pacific Vision, in particular during this sensitive period of where the military government has taken over the country, because they don't want to, push the Chinese away. The Cambodians and Laotians still depend primarily on China for their economic development. They're not going to jump on the free and open Indo-Pacific Vision because they really need that economic investment to continue their development. Our Singaporean friends, they are very attached to a neutral position, and this is something that has allowed them to thrive and benefit from both the United States and China. Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Brunei, all similar dynamics. And I think I must have mentioned Indonesia, but Indonesia as well, they have benefited from their relationship with China, despite some of the challenges. And they are pretty realistic that the region's economic future is going to be tied to China. At the same time, I think that they see Japan's long-term engagement as, I won't say questionable, but I think that they understand that the power shift in the region is definitely towards China, and that it will take a considerable aligning of many, many, many countries to balance China. Your second question, can you just say the second question again?
Yes, based on recent surveys for many years, that Japan is the most trusted partner in Southeast Asian region. So, do you think that Japan can take the leadership role in the free and open Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
Well, arguably, yes, but that will take a considerable alignment of a lot of stars. So, within the Japanese context, since the stepping down of former Prime Minister Abe, we haven't really seen a forward-leaning Indo-Pacific Prime Minister. And even, I think, Prime Minister Kishida, with his electoral result yesterday, the reality is that he'll be likely weaker, and he's going to have to defend his position in another election in July 2022. So he's likely going to be concentrating on that, and this is going to create some challenges for Japan in terms of having a very proactive leadership position moving forward. It's my assumption that Mr. Kishida will fly to Washington within the next month to have a handshake with Mr. Biden and to demonstrate that the alliance is going to remain intact. It's my assumption that he will fly to Vietnam and Indonesia and likely Singapore in the coming months to reaffirm Japan's commitment to the region. But we need sustained leadership from Japan, and that means a lot of face time in the region and directing resources to the region. Can Japan be the leader? Well, I think it can lead on infrastructure connectivity, perhaps inclusive development, perhaps in forging various kinds of multilateral cooperations, for example, between India and Australia, or between, let's say, France, Japan, and a third country. So I think there's a lot of different combinations that Japan can bring to the table in terms of leading the free and open Indo-Pacific. But ultimately, the United States has different resources, and I'm not just talking about its military resources that it lends to the table. And the competition within the region is largely being shaped by China and the United States. And Japan plays, like other countries, a secondary role in that broader competition. Not because it's not important, but I think its interests in many ways align much more with the United States than their Chinese neighbor.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Lynn. Thank you for the question. Good one.
Thank you, Lynn. Let's see, Raymond. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Good evening. Can
Hey,
you hear
Raymond.
me?
Good to hear
Hi,
from you.
Stephen.
well.
Good to hear from you too. Okay. Thank you very much for the insightful discussions and questions, answers as well. Thank you for having me. I've known Stephen for many years since I was an impressionable younger man. So I'd like to chime in. Basically, okay, just to introduce myself, I'm a native Southeast Asian from Malaysia originally. Lived in Japan for 13 years and 2 years in the US. Then I'm back. I'm back in Singapore. I've been here for 2.5 years, so I can see the various trends in the respective regions. So okay, just want to basically chime in on a few things, sort of to correct some misconceptions. Okay, so to explain my stance. So okay, firstly, the respective Southeast ASEAN states, the number one interest that they have are basically are national interests. And when I say national interests, I mean the elite, the respective elites' economic and developmental interests. Because all Southeast Asian countries are either liberal democracies or non-democracies, with the exception of Indonesia. But even Indonesia is an elite-dominated state. Secondly, okay, this leads to bandwagoning and hedging. So these two, especially hedging, the word came up quite a lot. Okay, based on my conversations, my readings across many years, Southeast Asia, all these Southeast Asian states, since their number one interest is actually their own national interest, they both bandwagon. That means they get together with either China or the US or some other player, or hedge each other. And this is not basically it's not a dichotomy between security and economy. They transcend both security and economic issues. So that means all these Southeast Asian states, they bandwagon as well as hedge. Okay, the third point is, I think, unfortunately, the discussion here has been perhaps a bit optimistic about the coherence of ASEAN. Because, so there's a saying, ASEAN is like air. I mean, you can't see it, it's in the background, nobody cares, but without it, we die. So ASEAN basically is a lowest common denominator kind of a regional integration. It's not principles-based. And it's great in avoiding war, regional war and big power politics so far, but I think the respective ASEAN states have been diverging from each other. For example, AUKUS, right? You mentioned the word AUKUS. So the respective ASEAN countries have had very different reactions. Singapore and Vietnam, they were openly supportive. Thailand was silent. Indonesia and Malaysia, they voiced their not opposition but apprehension that it would lead to a new arms race. So basically, I think ASEAN could be overrated as a regional body, as a fulcrum for national and economic security in the region because it's so divergent. They are also different states. So this leads me to some of my questions for Stephen and the others. Number one, since ASEAN is not really that coherent, how can it play a central pivotal role as a fulcrum between these competing blocks of states when it's not coherent and it's in fact becoming divergent? So that's the first question. Second question, right? So I'm from the private sector. I'm not an IR scholar, although I studied at university. How can extreme competition, as what that's Biden's quote, how could extreme competition between states coexist with greater collaboration between the states as well as private sector players? Private sector players, they want profits. Even as we speak, for example, Japan is a Quad member, but its private sector, its companies are still heavily investing in China, and they are apprehensive, but they are still going in. So how can they coexist, basically? The third one is so how South Korea and Japan, how could they play a more independent role as a middle power in the region? Yes, I know there are some there are issues. They are more inward-looking. They don't have a coherent strategy. But like in business, like in the economy, the more players you have, the better. We do not want a monopoly, an oligarchy. And I believe that no ASEAN state today wants based on oligarchy or monopoly of both security, from the security and economic perspectives. So that's all from me. Apologies if it's a bit long. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. Great questions. I agree. I think that ASEAN is superficially one big gang that's happy gang that's dealing with their issues within the region. But I think if you look at their track record, in particular over the past 2 or 3 years, it is moving in different directions, as you mentioned. And that's going to be difficult for ASEAN to retain its relevance moving forward. And I think it'll become increasingly difficult for those contradictions to be glossed over in terms of ASEAN really finding a position to try and shift things in a different direction. But that being said, I think that they can be an obstacle. And being an obstacle is sometimes the best way to still be seen as a player on the table. And I think that ASEAN will likely understand that it's in their collective and national interests to be part of shaping and shifting the Indo-Pacific vision so that it meets their national interests and perhaps their association's interests. I'm glad you mentioned that. I think the national interests are really, really critical, and arguably not being part of shaping the direction of the Indo-Pacific vision or strategy could really affect their national interests, and I think that's an important point. The second one was about the business community and where does it fit within this whole Indo-Pacific process and the strategic competition between the United States and China? Well, I think it's pretty clear. If you look at the AmCham survey that came out of Shanghai, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, you look at the data from the Keidanren, the Japanese Business Federation, you look at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in China, as well as others, they all want to be part of the Chinese economy. They want to continue to remain engaged. At the same time, they would like a fair playing field in terms of how they compete with Chinese companies in China. So you're correct that there's still a strong economic reason for wanting to be in the region. They don't want to say no to the Chinese market. And that's the similar dilemma to, I think, Southeast Asian countries and other countries, is that there's enormous opportunity from China. The question is are the domestic changes in China today and the vision of the CCP today, is that in line with their interests, and can they benefit from this view? And I think it's an open question. Really, the national intelligence law that was adopted in 2015, the cybersecurity law that was adopted in 2016 in China, really creates challenges for, I think, foreign businesses in terms of owning their data, in terms of and open questions about how safe is their data and their information systems from the Chinese government if there is a problem. And I think that there's other general trends in the Chinese context with the state, taking over tech firms that raise questions in terms of what is the role of the party and the state in the economy, and is this compatible with open competition in market systems? I'm not sure at this stage. I think we'll have to watch it post 20th Party Congress and in 2020, and we will see what is the vision of the party and Xi Jinping for the economy moving forward. And if it is a more state-driven economy, this will create challenges, I think, for businesses in terms of profitability and sustainability in China, in particular in very competitive sectors. The last question about middle powers, I think it's critically important that middle powers do try to shape the region's dynamics. I think that we don't want to be squeezed between China and the United States. And that means that we need to be proactively trying to influence the United States so that they adopt policies that reflect the interests of middle powers. And I think that's, Japan's been doing that, Australia's been trying to do that, other countries have been trying to do that. But they also have to, find ways to bring China to the table, to cooperate with China, and send a signal to China that some of the things that it's doing is probably not as productive as it could be. So they do have an important role, but I don't think all middle powers are created equal. South Korea understands middle powers as somebody that, as South Korea being between China and the United States, where Japan is just trying to figure out what it means to be a middle power, and I don't think they've quite understood how they are positioned within that hierarchy. Canada has a more normative view of middle powers, where they're advocating for particular values and systems, and I think the declaration against arbitrary detention that was spearheaded by the Canadians and released in February 2021 is a good example of that. And our Australian friends have moved away from a more normative approach to middle power activities to a middle power that is proactively, thinking about military power and engagement at the same time. So it's a bit more complicated than just saying middle powers. I think that there's many kinds of middle powers, and there's new middle power identities emerging, and they'll play a different role in shaping the region.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Raymond. Great to hear from you.
Excuse me. In terms of middle powers, I have one point. So I have read one book written by the Australia International Relations expert Rory Metcalfe. I'm sure, Stephen, you know him.
Yeah.
Okay, he is very famous in terms of Indo-Pacific Strategy. His book is named as Indo-Pacific Pacific. I think you have similar opinions with that of his opinion. He argues that Indo-Pacific strategy is mainly an idea of middle powers rather than superpowers like the U.S. Okay, so yeah, U.S. has published its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2019 by the Department of Defense. But on the other hand, why is this new geopolitical concept of Pacific region widely accepted by the countries in this region, especially the middle powers such as Australia, Japan, India, and Indonesia, probably? So because these middle powers have the need to balance a rise in China, because as the middle powers, they have the fear that the rules-based international order will be threatened by a rising and more assertive China. Therefore, they have the needs to have the new geopolitical concept of Indo-Pacific strategy, and from population perspective, some middle powers such as Indonesia, South Korea, and Japan, and Australia, and India, they have more people than China. Okay, from population, from demographic perspective, and from economic perspective, all of them are rising. India is also a rising power, and Japan is very powerful in economic terms. So in the future, probably the total GDP of these middle powers in Indo-Pacific region will be more than China. And from military perspective, probably they will have more defense budget than China. Therefore, the Indo-Pacific strategy is not only an idea of the U.S., it's also welcome and accepted by the middle powers in Indo-Pacific region, and they are playing very important role. So I do agree with your opinion that Indo-Pacific strategy is not only about great power politics between China and the U.S., and the middle powers are also playing an increasingly important role in this region.
Yeah, thank you, Chao-Ting. I would agree with that, and I think increasingly we're going to see a larger and larger role for middle powers. but I think we should also be realistic that there seems to be a lot more alignment in terms of, I guess, broader interests of how they would like the region to evolve with the United States, especially under the Biden administration, compared to an alignment with, I think, how China would like to see the region emerge. I would just like to also mention that how fragile this is. And what I mean by that is the Biden administration may may not be successful in its infrastructure packages and being reelected. And we could potentially see the former president of the United States return into power, or somebody that has similar politics. And I guess my fear is, how would countries within this region manage, and how would they react to this particular circumstance? So I do think we really need to consider what's happening in the United States in terms of its domestic politics and how this is going to impact the region's development. At the same time, I think in the Chinese context, where is China headed? What is the sustainability of its economic growth? What is it offering to the region besides economic engagement? And these are some really serious questions as well. The data in the Chinese economy is much worse than I think it was expected. Growth is about 4.9%, perhaps. The downward pressures on the Chinese economy continues. We don't really have a strong sense of where China is going to be going in terms of leadership under Xi Jinping. Will it continue to, will hard authoritarianism continue to be the guiding force of China? And what does this mean for China opening up and the second period of open reform? And what will this mean for Southeast Asia and Japan and other stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific? So there's a lot on the table, and I think we need to really think about the long-term trends that are going to affect the decisions of Southeast Asian countries, like Raymond said, national interests, and viability of ASEAN moving forward, and how is leadership in the various capitals going to affect Indo-Pacific alignment, the role of middle powers, and their ability to shape the region.
Stephen,
Yeah,
I qualified national interest as national elite interest. May not truly be popular or national interest.
Absolutely.
I have a question to all, not just Stephen, but the old audience, or maybe some listeners, if you have an answer to this. But in human history, has there been a story, or should I say, or history, that the middle power countries were able to work together to fence off an aggressive big country's neighbor? I'm just curious, and if we can learn from the history, maybe there's some hint in it, but maybe there's no such history. Does anybody know if such history ever exists in human history? I think this is open discussion, so maybe I jumped too far, but I will argue this is a fair question. Has middle power countries ever had a history to be able to do this?
Anybody want to jump in?
Hi, Raymond here.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay, I realized that there's one organization that's missing from our discourse, which is CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, founded in 1954. It still exists, by the way. It's so the US is a member, but the prominent members are Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, Pakistan, France, and the UK. It's not a pure middle power organization, but I think it's close, and it is a historical precedent. So I'm not sure how many of you know this. It's quite obscure now, but I think this is worth studying. CETO, SEATO, as in the Southeast Asian version of NATO.
Okay, so Raymond, has what accomplishment has that treaty or group accomplished? Do you know? What did it do?
So it was formed as an anti-communist front. At the time, the wars in Indochina were raging on. So, it did stop. For example, it did help in stopping the communist insurgency in Malaya and Singapore, and to an extent the Philippines as well. Later on, Indonesia, through a lot of bloodshed, became anti-communist. So I wouldn't say it's so. I'm not sure whether you can call that a direct contribution, but I think CITO has certainly played a role, because with CITO, the Commonwealth troops were able to be based in Southeast Asia, in Malaya, in Indonesia, etc. Yeah.
Probably I have one example. So I think the European Union is a supranational organization of middle powers and smaller powers. France and Germany are main drivers of EU, and EU has made a significant achievement since its founding as a European community of steel and coal. Okay, and since then, I think they have made a huge achievements, at least from political and economic perspective. Of course, from military perspective, EU is not an independent player. Most EU member states are still members of NATO. So, but at least from economic and political perspective, some organizations of middle powers have made achievements.
But they need to have a common understanding of who their enemy is, and that seems to be the issue that Stefan has been talking about. That's my take on that's how I take out of this room, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Russia is perceived as common enemy of NATO at the time, but on the other hand, the fundamental driver of EU is not Russia. I think it's about the fear of repeating past wars between European countries, especially between France and Germany. Yeah, the two countries have launched too many wars, and they want to have one mechanism to avoid, to prevent this kind of wars from happening again. I think that's a fundamental reason of the foundation of EU.
So Ren, I just want to touch upon, because you used the word enemy, and I really don't like that word.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think it's important, and maybe it was just a slip of the tongue. Japan doesn't see China as its enemy at all. I don't think any Southeast Asian countries see China as its enemy. I don't think South Korea sees China as its enemy.
Oh. Can I make a correction there, if you allow me to? What I didn't mean that. I meant when the middle power countries can unite together, they need to have a common enemy. That's why they can unite together. But I don't think Southeastern Asian countries see China as an enemy, so they can unite together. That was my point.
Yeah. I think common cause. I think that's a bit of a nuance. And I think that's really, really important for us to be thinking about the dynamics in the region, is that except perhaps North Korea, I don't think any country, except for North Korea, for example, I think the South Koreans view North Korea and the regime as potential enemy. But I think for most of the partners within the region, and this is maybe a positive thing to be thinking about, is there's problems in the relationship, but I think enemies is too strong of a term for thinking about the tensions within the region. And I hopefully our Chinese friends feel the same.
Hi, Raymond here. Can I add something? ASEAN started as an organization with a common enemy, i.e. Communism. So it was purely an anti-communist front with the 5 original members: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand. So it was very cohesive. It became less cohesive when new members came into being, and then communism as a global force lost traction. So now, so it started off with a common enemy, very cohesive, but now it's wavering, unfortunately.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for that, Raymond. We also still have Umesh. Umesh, sorry for keeping you waiting.
My pleasure, Maya, and my pleasure, Stephen, for giving me the opportunity in this forum. I would like to ask about the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Trade, the Pacific Pact. Both Taiwan and China have applied for the membership. And considering that stringent human rights, will China will be able to make to the organization? And what will happen if Taiwan were to be included in the CPTPP?
Thanks, Umesh. So I think that, quite honestly, it's unrealistic for either country to be joining. I think that Taiwan's application will be blocked by China putting pressure perhaps on Vietnam or Malaysia or some of the other signatories within the region. But it's a possibility. I think on paper they can get there. And for China, I think that the intellectual property right issues, the growing role of the state-owned enterprises make it probably not possible for China to join. But there are discussions in Tokyo about bringing in both China and Taiwan to the TPP at the same time, and that this would be useful in compelling the United States to re-engage back into the region on a trade policy and trying to set the groundwork for a TPP 2.0 that is led by the United States and focusing on middle class agenda that adopts a lot of what's in the TPP but adds a little bit more. So I don't think that's out of the question. I think that countries like Japan's long-term interest is anchoring the United States diplomatically, economically in the region, and there is a possibility that could, the Japanese could prolong the accession negotiations with both Taiwan and China as a strong message to the United States that they need to get back into the region and back into big trading agreements, and that they'd be willing to have a middle-class agenda. And I think if you've been following, what's happening in terms of politics in Japan, Kishida's talked about new capitalism. We have growing views about the importance of the middle class in many countries, including TPP countries. And I think that this is something that you should keep your eyes on.
Thank you, Stephen. So it's really reassuring to hear that, the countries in the region are not thinking in terms of enemies and military conflicts.
Thanks to everybody on the call, Han, Raymond, Chao-Ting, Maya, and Lynn, and Ren, everybody who provided their insights. These rooms are about sharing views and sharing analysis and sharing expert ideas, but also amateur ideas so that we can get a better understanding of the Indo-Pacific and its geopolitics and Japan's role in the region. And I think because of everybody on the call, we were able to do that. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you had a scary Halloween, and I look forward to talking to you from Tokyo in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.